Thank you.
On one hand, I got intimidated when I saw the size of the room, but now since I know it's just family, we can be relaxed and we can chat. Okay, so the title of this particular presentation, as you can see, is Black Students and the COVID Learning Gap. And I want to tell you how it is, or why it is that I chose this particular research. Even though I had worked in higher education for about 17 years, for 22, I've been in education for 22 years, and 5 of those years I spent in secondary education in a high school in Atlanta, Georgia. So the last, and so when I was at that high school, for the first 2 years of COVID were my last 2 years at the high school. So I saw a number of things and issues that were caused by COVID, but also highlighted by COVID. So, and I feel like this is particularly important when we talk about Black children and how they're learning, because we already know there's been a great deal of talk about the academic achievement gap, but what a lot of people don't talk about is how this is historical racial inequity at play, and COVID only exacerbated those issues, so this is nothing new. All right? Overview. The 3 things that I want to be able to cover today, and I want you guys to be able to ask questions, and I think we can have a relaxed atmosphere. You know, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'd like to answer any question if I can. And so these are the 3 things I want to cover. I want to talk about how the learning gap between Black students and their non-Black peers continues to grow and contribute to a larger looming issue, right? Or larger looming issues, which are unemployment, underemployment, and also we talk about the underlying GDP. The GDP is affected. Second thing, I want to talk about how these funding inequities are actually rooted in racism. Number 3, I want to explain COVID did not create these problems. It only highlighted many and exacerbated others. So for those that are not necessarily familiar, I want to explain what the COVID learning gap is. The COVID learning gap is essentially a term coined by educators to explain this fundamental learning and achievement gap that continued to grow wider when students were forced to go home and be involved in virtual learning. Because when COVID first happened, what we have to understand is it was kind of like on-the-job training for educators, for parents, and students. Nobody had any sort of formal training in how to handle this virtual learning for all students at all ages. Now we know as higher ed educators and administrators, we've been doing online learning for quite a while, so we understand what that's like. But to be able to educate all the children from secondary to college, it took a new turn. So the COVID learning gap is especially a really important term, because what we found out is that 1 month of instruction, right? 1 month the student is behind in instruction can actually almost cause them to lose about a year of learning.
Yes.
A year of learning, right? So if you think about how many of our babies were at home during this particular time frame and didn't get the instruction that they needed, you think about how far they potentially could have fallen behind, because I think about 80 to 90% of the schools in the country when COVID first happened were virtual. And so there were a number of issues that were effectual here. And I think we also have to think about with a number of students, Black students, poor students, Latino students, a lot of these students were growing up in very chaotic and stressful environments in urban areas. So, and not to say that their white counterparts didn't experience the same sort of stress, right? But they experienced it on a greater level, right? And I don't want to compare poisons, because we can't. Yeah. But what happens is you look at a number of working class African American and Latino parents did not have the option of working remotely. So students became secondary caregivers. Students were suffering from food insecurity. we found that for a lot of them, the only time that they were really able to eat was during the school hours. Okay? And lastly, we also saw that with a lot of students did not have technological access, which I'm going to get into a little bit further later. But this is why that gap continued to grow, right? And it's really, I don't even like to say a gap, it's actually a chasm.
Yeah.
Okay? How race, class, and lack of educational equity exacerbated this gap. So first off, I want to kind of give you, I want to talk about how, again, racism and inequity predated the COVID gap.
Yes.
Okay? So even when we go back to 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. So when this law went into effect and we fought to have the right to desegregate schools, one of the things that was vastly looked over was the lack of funding that black schools had, right? And so in many cases, not all black folks were chomping at the bit to go to non-black schools.
Right.
What they really wanted was something equitable for their children. And so when these students began to leave and go to other school systems, right, we also found that the students who stayed behind in these urban areas began to suffer even more. Because now what they used in order to justify the inequity was the tax dollars that were taken from real estate. Because we know how according to the area, the per capita income, the taxes are taken. So this was now used as the justification.
I'll find it.
And so on this screen, this graphic that you see on the screen, I want to be very clear about what this graphic is, because I know you may not be able to necessarily understand it from your particular eye view. What this graphic essentially is showing the computer and internet issues that black students and poor students suffer from during COVID. So we see here that students who lived in households where parents made $30,000 or less, these students, 43% of these students had no internet or unreliable computers, right? In many cases, in many school districts, we saw in poor school districts where they didn't even have devices that they were able to hand out to the students during the time of this virtual learning. So then, in some school districts, I remember in Florida, and I'm sure you all are familiar with this because we know a lot of crazy stuff happens in Florida. We kept seeing these incidents in Florida where in certain impoverished communities, parents were beginning to take their children's school devices to the pawn shop. Now, if we watch Fox News and other news stations that have a particular slant, we would think, oh, these parents are on drugs, that's why they're doing this to their kids. No. A lot of working class African American and Latino people lost their employment during the pandemic. And so for some of these parents, it may have been the difference between that computer and my child eating.
Right.
So it was not necessarily this fact that the parents didn't care about their children's education, but a lot of these parents were making survival choices. And if in the same shoes, I probably would have done the same thing. And I'll teach Journey at home if I have to. So we have to think about what these things mean. Then for a number of other students, there were several cases, and I'm sure we saw it all over the country, where students, the tenacious ones, would actually go to the parking lots of restaurants that had internet service so that they could try to do their homework, right? But what did that mean for students who didn't even have those things in their inner city areas? Because if we look at this and we think about this in our mind's eye, many of these urban areas don't even have restaurants, right? We talk about franchise restaurants that would have access. Because most of these kids live in food deserts, where there is no access to healthy eating options or anything that would have an internet option. So we see how this is just further and further driving these kids to a place of desperation and isolation. And so we see, according to the statistics, about 22% of these students try to do their homework from their cell phones. And if if you know, even us as adults, trying to do something of that nature from a cell phone is just not gonna cut it. Right? Trying to go to school and do the homework, and let me tell you, as somebody who was in the school system during that time, a lot of what we did to engage the students required technology. So there's no way possible that they could be in the virtual class and then use the technology that we were asking them to use at the same time. Somebody or something is going to get lost in the shuffle, right? So we have to look at these things and think about what it is that, and how it is that the lack of equity and racism contributed to these things. Because let's be honest about it, one of the reasons why this was able to happen was because we already knew that within the context of many of these urban area schools, these black schools, that kids didn't have access to technology. So we knew this pre-COVID. And so COVID only heightened the situation because there was no funding put in place to address these issues. So I already kind of talked about how inequity predates COVID. But this, when I was doing my research, this absolutely blew my mind. So if you remember now, at the beginning of this, I talked about how one of the things that we also see is that this achievement gap affects our GDP. And for, just in case you don't know what the GDP is the gross domestic product for America. It means like how much our country makes every year. Okay, that's a simplified version. Well, according to statistics, if the achievement gap, right? If the achievement gap had been solved in 1998, by 2008, America could have made $1 trillion more in GDP. Does that not make you stop in your tracks? Especially considering that the nation's average debt is $2 trillion. So to know not only could we eliminate the nation's national debt, but we could also take many of the people who are in poverty out of poverty simply by education. It gives us a new understanding of why closing the achievement gap is so important. And I see, even though I've talked about racism and inequity being the root of the issue, I think that what angers me the most is that we continue in this country to struggle in our educational system, knowing that a lack of education is leaving the vast majority behind. It leaves the vast majority behind. One of the things that sometimes it irks people, but I have to. Every child, every teenager that I meet, I'm always asking them about, what are your goals? Yeah. Do you want to go to college? What do you want to do after, right? Even kids that parents didn't go to college, I don't care what their parents did, I'm asking them, what do you want to do? And often I would tell them to be disobedient to their parents. Let me tell you why. Because in our community, one of the mistakes that often African American parents make is to tell their children to get an education so that they can get a good job. That is not the rationale for education. Education is supposed to change you in such a way that you're able to make change in your community and change the way you live. And we know within the African American community that education is the last door opener. We don't come from families that own businesses. We don't come from families that own corporations. There cannot be any nepotism. So we have to create these opportunities through education. And I think that this presentation at this particular conference becomes even more important to me, because when we talk about creating opportunities, one of the things that we also have to understand is we have to stop asking others for a seat at the table and begin to create our own tables. If you look around the country right now, there's an all-out assault on anything having to do with black people. Point blank, period. Okay? There's an all-out assault. There's an assault against black history. There's assault against culturally relevant teaching. There's an assault, and really even Latino studies to some degree. Yes. But what happens as a result of these young people being left out? So when we leave Black history out of American history, what we told them is that you're not important. When we don't try to create culturally relevant teaching, even in the context of the COVID learning gap, when we were talking about going virtually, many of you may not know this because many of you may or may not have experience with secondary education. During this time, there was still a lot of life around 1619 projects. Well, in Georgia, what they would do is, because we were virtual, they would have people to pop into your classroom every now and again, and a lot of educators were threatened with losing their job if they taught the 1619 project, right? And let me tell you, I have a problem with critical race theory. It ain't no theory, it's history. So what happens is that we have to know that this is critical for everybody, not just Black children. Because if white children are going to be able to stop white privilege, they have to know the basis by which white privilege has damaged and harmed other people, right? And I'm still on the subject of school equity. I'm still on the subject of funding equity, because even when we have these school board meetings, and we see this around the country on the news, when folks are fighting to get equitable school districts, we see those who believe that something is being taken away from them arguing, no, we can't give away all our money, and we can't do this, and that's taking away from our kids. This whole notion of, well, if they would just work harder. Folks, that is the most foolish thing ever, right? There's a book that I always recommend to people, because I think it is very much appropriate for every facet of American society. And the book is called Brainwash, the Myth of Black Inferiority by Tom Morello, right? And in this particular text, he talks about how during slavery, Black folks were categorized as most trusting and most industrious and most hardworking by white people. After slavery, Black folks were categorized as lazy, and we were stereotyped as non-working, ignorant, poor, all of these sort of things, right? After slavery. And we already know what that connection is. But where the problem comes in is the persistence of those stereotypes. Because if we look at how these stereotypes persist, we also understand why inequity is never really brought to the table. Because instead of folks looking at how this lack of funding within urban school systems, poor school systems, and Black school systems is affecting Black children and poor children, instead of them looking at that, what they do is they say, well, Black kids don't want to learn. Black kids don't like to read. Black parents don't like to be involved in the school system. But we know that's a lie. We know that that is the fruit, but not the root. So we've got to change how these things are done. Equity is a necessity. As we know, most of the evidence shows that money matters. I give you, I'm not even going to read what's on the screen, but I'll give you something that I found out recently that was absolutely mind-blowing. One of the things that folks love to do is to question the relevance of historically Black colleges and universities. And let me tell you, I fight like Mike Tyson when folks do so. Even folks in my own color, right? Because all skin folk ain't kin folk, so you gotta let them know. But historically Black colleges and universities are more relevant now than ever before. So what happens is that when we talk about this lack of equity in educational funding, when the students come to us at an historically Black college, we know that we already have to take them from 10th grade to college freshman within that freshman year. And I don't care what school they're at, because you know they have us to believe that at some of the more elite historically Black colleges and universities, that doesn't happen. It's lies. I've worked at one of the very elite historically Black colleges and universities, and we had a program, they just didn't call it the quality enhancement plan, they called it a metacognitive study. Gave it a fancy name, right? But at the end of the day, what it was still about was teaching students how to improve their reading and writing abilities across the board. Now we also know white students are coming in behind too, right? But our students need even more individualized attention and instruction. So this particular statistic says that increased spending improves college attendance rates, graduation rates, and test scores. So if we were to put simply $1,000 a year extra into individual students, we would be amazed at how their test scores would improve. Give you this tidbit of information I found out recently. The state of Tennessee owes Tennessee State University over $500 million from funding that they conveniently forgot to give Tennessee State. I bet you they didn't forget to give UT Knoxville their money. They didn't forget to give Vanderbilt their money. But they conveniently forgot to give Tennessee State University $500 million. Now, some may say, well, why does it matter? They didn't even know they weren't getting it. Why it matters is that funding could be used to enhance not only the facilities of our students, but it could be used to enhance the technology, to get more teachers, to improve the pay of teachers, because we even know the pay of professors at historically black colleges is not in alignment with the pay that professors at predominantly white institutions receive, which is why a lot of times we lose a lot of good talent to larger, whiter institutions. So we got to think about what that money translates into as it concerns in making equitable educational opportunities. The after effects of COVID. First after effect, staff shortages. We already know that teachers weren't really making any money. And that's from the littlest ones, the daycare workers, all the way up to college professors. I used to tell people, because people will assume that your title, they think, well, you're Professor so-and-so and you work at this university, and people, and I'll say it in a very Afrish way, and I use Afrish instead of Ebonics, because the African American vernacular is a language. We will not diminish it by calling it Ebonics. Afrish is a very real thing. I'll say it in Afrish. Black folk like to count your money. And so they will assume because you work in higher ed that you make all this money. But what we did, or what we do generally, a lot of times we do out of love. Right? And because the money is not attached to it. Now you may have a wonderful schedule because you may work Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday and Thursday, as opposed to working every day my career back in right? But the money ain't there, okay? So what happens is that if we would be able to put this money, we wouldn't necessarily have to worry about the retention issues that we see on a lot of these college campuses. Because truthfully, we can't be loyal to people that are not loyal to us. And loyalty is also translated into dollars. Yes. Right? Because I can't be here giving you my all and not be paid for what I'm doing. Because my pay is my livelihood. That's right. I can't pay my bills with love. I can't pay my mortgage with my love for the institution. And that's what folks would have us to believe is necessary, and it's not. But we need equity in funding. So staff shortages is something that we experienced because a number of educators were already leaving the field before COVID. So imagine the stress and duress that they were under when COVID hit. So now we find, and this what this chart shows us essentially is the rate at which teachers were quitting outpaced the rate at which they could actually hire teachers. So meaning people were quitting faster than people were being hired. I think in Atlanta alone, they lost about 3,000 school teachers. And in some school districts, I think it was, I was looking at something about Oklahoma, in some school districts, they got so desperate that they started employing bus drivers and other service people who didn't necessarily have to have a college degree to be permanent subs. And I don't say this to be condescending, but if we are teachers, that means that there has to be a certain mastery of the information that you're teaching. It can't be just because you're an adult who has held a job. It has to be a certain mastery of information. So with us employing people who are not necessarily in the educational field and are not educated beyond high school, we put ourselves in an even more precarious position. Next issue that we see, increased mental health issues. A lot of times people will talk about how the kids are suffering, but folks, educators are suffering. And I would tell them in my church this because they would always pray for the kids. I said, no, y'all need to add teachers to this. Because while you got one baby at the school, that teacher has 36.
Yeah.
And she's not, that teacher's not getting the same person that you get within the context of your household. Because there's nothing that would stop them from talking to Dr. Daniels crazy. Dr. Daniels does not have the power or the authority to stop them from doing whatever you can stop them from doing in your household. So it's not the same person. So coupled with low pay, disrespect, and being overwhelmed, a lot of people say, I don't have to take this, I'm leaving. And so those mental health issues for the people that stayed continue to grow. And so what the gray and the red shows is, the gray shows the thickness of the brain pre-COVID. The red shows the thickness of the brain during COVID. Meaning that those factors like anxiety, stress, chaos, confusion, all the things that were affecting these educators and students at that time caused them to develop, caused their brain to develop in several different ways that were negative. What will it take to close the gap? Number one, we've got to start pressing our elected officials, our government about making sure that we change the policies that are in existence for how we fund schools. Because we know a lot of times schools are funded by the tax districts that they're in. And the higher the property value, the more funding they may get for that particular area. So we got to change that dynamic because that's still very much race-based. And they know it. So we got to change that particular funding dynamic. Number two, we got to make social emotional learning and mental health part of the everyday curriculum. It can't be a side thing. It has to be just as important as social studies or science. There has to be a time designated for social emotional learning and mental wellness. And it has to be for teachers and students. Lastly, we have to find ways to include parents, guardians, and incorporate community partners into the learning process. Now, a lot of times, especially in urban school districts, people will tell you that it's tough to get parents involved. Parents won't show up to PTA meetings, they won't be involved in different school activities. Well, come look at Crook, we gotta find a way, even if that has to be virtual PTA meetings, even if it has to be consistent and persistent virtual newsletters that we send out to parents to let them know what is happening at school. Even if it is getting community partners to volunteer time in the school system so that they can become volunteers and mentors for the students within the schools. But something has to happen that we draw in the community because the community is necessary if we're going to change the trajectory of education. And so that is the end, folks. Does anybody have any questions or concerns they would like to pose?
Well, I have, if I may.
Yes, sir.
And this is a question which piqued my interest from the beginning. And that is, you mentioned that you taught for a couple of years in the Atlanta area. And I'm curious, I want to ask you which specific school. I live in Atlanta.
Okay.
But I'll ask you which school district. I'm just curious. Was it the Atlanta Independent School District, or was it?
It was Fulton County.
It was Fulton County School.
Fulton County.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
So I taught, I taught at one high school, but Farmington one high school. I was a college readiness and career coach at an alternative school.
Okay.
And that was a mind-blowing
I was
experience.
about to say, you learned a lot.
I learned a lot,
Yeah.
emotionally and professionally, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because at first I thought maybe God was punishing me, and I thought, now what did I do in former life to end up at an alternative school, right? But I really believe that a lot of the things I learned at the alternative school and a lot of things I learned in the secondary school system were things that I was able to use in higher ed.
Right.
So, but I worked in the AUC altogether for about 10 years. Any other questions or any comments even? Any comments that anybody wants to make? Yes, ma'am.
So first of all, thank you for doing this work. I think as I'm watching you, like I was thinking to myself, even in the DMV area, the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, it'd be really interesting to kind of look at the gap, because it was really obvious as we returned to the classroom in terms of some of the, first of all, their capacity to even engage with each other in the classroom had been diminished substantially, right? And we knew the students had been on their technology in classrooms, like I banned technology in my classroom, but it was just interesting how reliant as some form of distraction or some form of like getting their brain to process for them to look down and engage with their phone. And I was maybe touched by the social emotional learning and how important that is, because I think as a society we don't value other types of intelligences that we should be producing in our students, and their capacity for like emotional intelligence has been diminished, right, since they're relying on technology and all of their emotion is channeled into their electronics, right, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, or whatever. So I'm just, I thank you for that, and thank you for bringing that up. I guess I'm curious, as we are thinking forward, whether it's to mitigate another pandemic, because we never know like what's coming around the corner. Like, what are your, and I know like you're wanting us to be more cognizant of like what like funding and that kind of stuff, but maybe asking like what your biggest learning was from doing this research, and then also if you had to be like one thing, if we could just do this thing, it could really help us make up the difference, or you know, what would you say?
My one big thing that I really took away from this research was the GDP, how the lack of equity affected the GDP.
Right.
That was mind-blowing. We know, we see the studies that talk about how a high school graduate makes a certain amount of money compared to a college graduate, right? But in many ways, I don't even think that is true anymore, because what happens is that when we look at how there has been an influx of proprietary institutions who have basically become diploma bills,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Degrees are very common now, right? But that doesn't mean that necessarily people are learning.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean people are learning, right? And so when we look at this now, I think a lot of employers are also getting hip to the same thing, right? So they're not paying as much as they used to pay for these specific degrees. And on one hand, it's like we know that our students, and this is what I stress to young people when I talk about education. College is not necessarily for everybody, but there's some type of schooling that needs.
Yes. Yes.
Right? If it be trade school, and people will have issue with that because they think that you're trying to force your philosophies on them. No, what I'm saying is we live in a world that wants learning people. So high school is not going to be sufficient. It's going to have to be cosmetology school. It's going to have to be HVAC school. There's going to have to be some training beyond high school. Because we don't live in the world that our parents lived in, where they could work a government job for 20 and 30 years and get a really nice pension and live really well. Even when we look at now, I was having a conversation with some co-workers, and we were talking about home ownership. You have a lot of people now that on paper they live below the poverty line, but financially they're not even able to purchase homes anymore. And we know, again, that home ownership is the door opener to wealth building. So how is that only possible if people can't afford homes? So just looking at that, the GDP was like mind blowing for me. The biggest takeaway, I think, is I'm very vocal about closing that gap on the college level, right? Because professors seem to be so surprised, and so many professors like to think that those issues are only akin to their specific university. Have y'all experienced that? Where they're like, only at Tougaloo will kids not come to class. Only at Fort Valley will kids not turn in work. No, that's an everywhere issue.
That's true.
Everywhere, black, white, and otherwise. Because just like my friend said right here, after COVID, what we didn't realize is when these kids came back from virtual learning,
That's right.
their attention spans got even worse.
That's right.
So it is not sufficient to complain about what they can't do. We gotta find ways to close that gap. And so a lot of times, on the collegiate level, we find people that are experts in knowledge, but their pedagogy is not necessarily there.
Exactly.
Right? And so I know at my last institution, they'd be like, okay, what workshop is Dr. Hall creating now? And it was because I realized that pedagogy was the missing element. Yes, you may have 2 PhDs, one in molecular science and the other in stem cell research, but you don't know how to teach.
Right.
Exactly.
That's the missing part.
Right.
And so, and the thing is, and there's some, I've been doing this 20 years, and students have been complaining for 20 years. Now, believe me,
For 20 years back. Like,
Are they learning? Are they
What
learning?
year did you come out of college?
College?
Mhm.
95.
Okay, so we came out around the same time. I came out in '97. The reason why I'm mentioning that is this. When we were in school, if a professor was horrible, we grinned and buried it. You got with the study group, you chumped down, you said, oh, I hate the way Dr. So-and-so teaches, oh my God, he's so boring. He never breaks stuff down, but you got your study group, and y'all were going in, breaking down this information together, and you make sure you sit in the front of the class. Because you knew, professors back then, there was no, it was, ma'am, you never ask questions. No, my office hours are not for that. Now, they almost want us to go home with the kids to teach them, right? But some of that could be undone if we would teach folks how to teach. Now, do I believe kids lie when they say, well, I made a bad grade because Dr. Smothers is boring? Yes, definitely. Because they can lie cutthroat. They can lie issue fired if they don't like the grade they receive. And that I'm very much aware of. However, I'm also aware of the fact that there are a number of our colleagues that need pedagogical approaches to kind of to bridge that gap that our students are experiencing. And so these are things that I think that are fundamentally necessary, and a lot of times I go, because I have an educational consulting business, I go to different schools around the country and teach people how to solve this pedagogy gap, right? Teaching them about scaffold teaching, you know, and looking back, I know that God put me in a high school because these are things I had to do in the secondary world, right? So they're real life approaches. And also, we have to understand too, that beforehand, before COVID, Black students were already coming in college in our schools reading top-notch 9th, 10th grade level. Think about how much further back that is now because of COVID.
Right.
People are literally writing essays in text language. And you think you can't be serious. I've gotten emails that were about 10 lines long. Now mind you, and I'm not saying my title to boast, but giving you an example. I got emails as an associate vice president that said, hey, I need to talk to you because so-and-so, all text language.
Yeah.
And the words are misspelled. And so what happens is if I allow them to have a meeting with me and they come in, I said, now you do know Now, I know you came in to say that Dr. So-and-so or this class is not good, you're struggling. I said, but we can't let you graduate
Exactly.
from the school with this, because if we let you leave here and you write like this,
That's right.
our degree is not worth the paper it's printed on.
That's right.
So all of those things become really, really important, and I think that we've got to find ways to address those issues, even if it's what we do outside of the classroom with workshops or professional development opportunities, whatever it is, we got to make sure it happens. Yes, ma'am.
I'm kind of in a unique position because I teach teachers, I teach students in a high school that has concurrent credit, and I teach undergrads and grads. So I kind of see this COVID descending upon all groups, right? So the students in my classrooms that are high school level are sort of deer in the headlights. I can't do anything. They're frozen in place, and motivation is at the very lowest I've ever seen in 25 years of teaching. The principals have told us to pull back work at least by 20 to 30 to 40%, you know, so we're having to cut out things. The students expect so much more from the teacher than the teacher is able to give because they're strained. So I run a program in Arkansas, Advanced Biology Plus, and there's 50 teachers in our program, and we've lost about 10. And in any previous years, it was 1 to 2. You know, from the field of education, not moving to a different district. They are overwhelmed, they are completely ignored, because I hear this from all of them. Now, the district superintendents and principals are equally strained. It just keeps going up, and there's nowhere where it stops, and I don't have magic answers. But just recognizing, and I do, every workshop I start with, we're in trouble, and I know you suffer, and I'm here to help any way I can to ease it. You know, don't expect miracles right now. You know, getting through is what we've got to do, right? That's all we can do at the moment.
We had a teacher from the story. We had a teacher that left about a month into the school year to become a lash tech. She said, I make more money doing it. And we were like, lash tech, right? A lash tech. You know, the person that puts on the lashes.
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she left about a month. She left like a month into the school year.
And that's so sad, losing that talent too.
Yeah.
Right, and she said, she told us, because we were like, you doing what? She said, I make more money doing lashes in my basement than I do here, and I don't have to deal with the stress. I'm out. She was willing to let go of benefits, pension, all of it. Because just couldn't take it anymore. Just couldn't take it anymore. I considered going to work at Target, and I was like, you know, I don't really have to have this house. I could go live across the street with my best friend, maybe rent a room, because this ain't giving what it's supposed to give. So, you know, I consider those things, but I think that sometimes when God has a call on your life, you can't necessarily choose to do something else.
That's true.
You know, and I always say teaching is a lot like preaching.
Yes.
You got to be chosen,
Yes.
right? And you have to have the tenacity, right? You got to have the tenacity, because what happens is a lot of times, and sometimes people find it hard to understand. They say, well, you don't love teaching. You have a love-hate relationship. You have a love-hate relationship, because I still have relationships with babies that I taught 20 years ago. My students from Clark, my students I started with at Morris Brown, right? And at the time when I started with them, I was only like 5, 6 years older than them. But they'll still invite me, Professor Hall, remember when you said so-and-so? And sometimes I think God allows them to do that to remind me that I'm walking in my purpose. But I'm still, for students that graduated, teacher, preacher, financial counselor. No, you don't need to go on vacation again. You need to save that money. No, you can't leave that job. Okay? And that boyfriend, how long we gonna go through this? How many times you gonna call me about that boyfriend? You know, so you gotta be teacher,
Or
preacher.
girlfriend.
Okay.
That's right.
Sometimes
That's right.
No, you're right. You're right.
and that's like, cause it's like, you know, like a lot of my older professors said, Dr. Hall, you talk. I used to use, my Cadillac used to be a church man, cause they used to come to church with me. So I would have to do I wear a whole lot of hats.
Yeah.
And people ask me, don't you have kids? I wouldn't have time for kids of my own. Because all these hats that I have to wear on a consistent basis, I even sometimes have to buy groceries for babies, have to buy lunch, give them box money, right? So time is of the essence. And I love what I do, but sometimes it can be draining. It can be draining, but I do thank God that I'm out the classroom, because now I'm able to make change on a greater level. And just to be quite honest, the classroom has become more stressful. It has become more stressful. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Hall, thank you for this presentation. We did some research at Grambling State in the midst of COVID. I mean, the second week they sent us home, I was like on the phone with colleagues, like, we got to figure this out, y'all. We're at home. We got to ask the students. We got ourselves. We have to question ourselves because there's something that's going on. They didn't understand the homeschooling piece of it, but I worked in government before coming into higher ed, so I know when they shut the government down, we're going to be home for a little bit. They don't shut the government down just for anything. And to capture that, and now to see you do this presentation, I just want to ask if you would be willing to share this. Hopefully we can use your tape. I want to drop it in my class as an assignment, but also I would like to invite you to come to our institution and some others so that a larger audience can kind of capture it. I think it's the elephant in the room, as you mentioned previously about, you know, we know we're in trouble and we really don't know how to get out of it, and we've kind of gone back. Look at us in here. I had my mask and I haven't worn it today, and I know I should have it on. So we all are laxing a little bit, but the COVID is still out there and it's not going anywhere. And I love the way you've taken the 3 steps of it and kind of given us the roadmap for a conclusion on where we can take it back to our institution. So I didn't have a question. I just wanted to thank you for the research. And like the sister said earlier, I applaud you on this research, and let's see how we can keep in touch and take care of ourselves as well as those that we teach at all levels. So thank you very much.
But thank you guys for sharing your time with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.